Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second annual History Symposium, World War I. Our presenter today, Mr. Sal Buffo, is Professor of Psychology. Sal has been a full-time instructor here at Yavapai College for the past 5 years, teaching classes in introductory psychology, human growth and development, counseling skills, and crisis and trauma intervention. Prior to teaching full-time, Sal was a practicing therapist and a mental health clinical specialist for 27 years. He also serves as a lead faculty for those students seeking degrees in social and human services. So please welcome Mr. Sal Buffo.
Thank you. And welcome. Thank you all for coming today. Much of what we have learned about psychological trauma comes from the direct observation of returning soldiers from combat and noticing the symptoms that they have shown because of this trauma that they've endured. Understanding the relationship between the mind and the body is still really in infancy, yet we do know that the mind can affect physical body in ways that we could never imagine. My hope today is to share with you how historically we came to have a better understanding of this thing that we call trauma, and how treatment of this disorder has changed throughout the years. But first, I must give you my disclaimer. Every good college professor has a disclaimer. And mine today is, I am a psychologist, I'm not a historian. So please forgive my attempts today of trying to sound more like a historian than a psychologist. Actually, I'm going to go back to this. I just have a few more things I want to say before I move on to that slide. Just a little bit about trauma itself. Trauma comes from the Greek word wound. And it is usually the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope, or even more important, one's ability to integrate the experience. We know that trauma is a subjective experience because people react to similar situations differently. In a psychological context, when we talk about trauma, we talk about a deep, disturbing experience. In medical terms, trauma still relates to a physical wound. Trauma changes the ability to make sense of the events in one's life and holds a central importance in how we find meaning in our lives. A student last year who returned back from Afghanistan shared with me that his personal experience of trauma changed his view of the world. It's a pretty powerful statement. So, I'm going to put my historian cap on now. And for those of you who are true historians, please forgive if I don't do this justice, but I'll do my best here. The Greek historian, Herodotus, who is known for documenting the events and war between Greece and the invasion from Persia, in the first battle that took place in Marathon in 490 BC, he wrote this: "A warrior went blind when he witnessed a fellow soldier killed, although the soldier who went blind was wounded with no part of his body." We even see reference in the Iliad by Homer that seems to resemble symptoms of post-traumatic stress syndrome. where Ajax loses a duel, comes under the spell of Athena, and then slaughters a herd of sheep, thinking that they are the enemy, and then ends up killing himself. Johannes Hofer, back in 1678, he was a Swiss physician. And during this time, there were many soldiers returning from foreign campaigns, Swiss soldiers that were returning from foreign campaigns. And he noticed that there seemed to be similarities in some of the symptoms and some of the reactions of these soldiers who returned from war. He even wrote a paper on it, trying to figure out what was the cause of these symptoms. He gave it a name. He gave it the name of nostalgia. Now, nostalgia is an interesting name that he used because nostalgia, in translation, in Greek translation, nostos means returning home, and algia stands for pain. So he witnessed these soldiers coming back from these campaigns, but they were in much pain. But this was rather significant when he did this, because it was the first time that the notion of any form of trauma was actually given a name. The symptoms that he noticed with these soldiers: melancholy, incessant thinking of home, disturbed sleep or insomnia, loss of appetite, high levels of anxiety, and cardiac palpitations, or we would know as tachycardia. During the era of Napoleon, and Napoleon being the Emperor of France that lasted from 1804 to 1815, here's a man who, with his army, fought 60 battles, only losing 7 of them towards the end, after the disastrous invasion of Russia and in 1812, and then finally defeated in 1815 at Waterloo. But his chief surgeon noticed something interesting with the soldiers that he was fighting next to, and the fact that he also saw these symptoms that were described as nostalgia. And he was maybe the first person to start thinking of some kind of way of treating these individuals who were traumatized by battle. And this is what he came up with: regular exercise, listening to music, and useful instruction. Now, I don't know about you. This sounds very, very nice, but it sounds more like a day at the spa than kind of returning from battle and trying to be treated. But the significance is something was trying to be done. Something was actually being implemented and to at least start to help some of these soldiers. Excuse me. During the Civil War, Dr. Jacob Mendez da Costa, he served as a physician at a military hospital. I think it was the first military hospital. I believe it was in Washington, D.C., as well as a physician at Turner's Hospital in Philadelphia. He was very, very curious about this notion of anxiety. Why did the battlefront affect these soldiers so severely? He gathered as much evidence as he could, and he wanted to do a study of anxiety per se. He studied actually 300 soldiers, and the similarities of their symptoms were all lined up. It all made sense. It all kind of, they presented in such a way that the symptoms all remained the same. And again, what he found with these soldiers are this chest thumping, as he called it, again, this notion of tachycardia, high degrees of anxiety, and hyperarousal and breathlessness. He called these symptoms the soldier's heart. And he believed that the nerves at the base of the heart were somehow affected to create this level of high anxiety. Now, it should be noted during the Civil War, there were a lot of technological advances that really became more negatively affected to the soldiers. For example, prior to the war, bullets that were fired from rifles, the bullets were round. If that bullet struck an individual and broke a bone, it would be a clean break. But during the Civil War, that changed, and bullets then became more like cylinders. And when that bullet struck the individual, it shattered the bone, which may have accounted for many, many amputations we read about the Civil War. So soldiers were more exposed to more carnage than in any other war. During the Civil War, military physicians were at a loss to treat this notion of soldier's heart. Soldiers were put on trains at times, and with their name on their tunics, and sent to their hometowns. Some were even left just to wander aimlessly about the countryside until they died from either exposure or starvation. So in 1863, because of the need to start treating some of these individuals, the first military hospital was established, and the primary diagnosis given to many, many of these soldiers was this notion of nostalgia. Just a side note, nostalgia was also referred to as neurasthenia, which by definition means a state of physical and mental exhaustion. Also, a little interesting side note, that the treatment of these soldiers, much of the treatment came out of a public outcry because so many soldiers were wandering through the countryside aimlessly, and some were described as acting almost insane, that the Army knew that they had to do something about this. And so that helped establish this first military hospital in treating the symptoms of this notion of nostalgia. Now, during this time, an interesting thing was happening after the Civil War, was the fact that the general public was becoming more aware of symptoms that might have been caused by trauma, not physical trauma, but something more psychological. During this time, railroad travel was becoming more predominant in the late 19th century. And so did railroad accidents. There were many, many railroad accidents that affected many, many people. A victim of a railroad accident were referred to as having railway spine, or as if their spinal cord had suffered a concussion that caused them to be more nervous or to cause them to be more traumatized afterwards. This was kind of clearly documented by the famous writer Charles Dickens. He wrote about being curiously weak, as if I were recovering from a long, long illness after a traumatizing railway accident in which the front of the train plunged off a bridge where 10 people died and another 49 were injured. Charles Dickens also wrote to his friends about this strange kind of psychological feelings that he was kind of overcome by after experiencing these accidents. He wrote to one friend, "I begin to feel it more in my head. I sleep well and eat well, but I write a half a dozen notes, and then I turn faint. I turn sick. I'm getting right, though, still low in pulse and very, very nervous." He also wrote that he was unable to travel on a train because every time he would step on the train, even a train that was not moving, he felt a feeling that the carriage of the train was almost tipping over, and he would start to lean. So he decided he could no longer ride on trains. Interesting enough, Charles Dickens died on the 5th anniversary of the train wreck that he was actually in. So during this episode, when this railway spine was kind of this phenomena that was happening, some people at the time believed that the symptoms of this railway spine was simply individuals who wanting compensation from the insurance companies or the railroad companies. So there was an interchange of how one was describing this phenomena. Some would call it railway spine, but others refer to it as compensation neurosis. Kind of like today, huh? Another interesting point, just for interest-wise, the fact that most people who suffered injury on these trains when there was an accident, their back was actually to the point where the acceleration of the train was happening. And it's very, very similar to what we now call whiplash. Another kind of important event that occurred that has to deal with acknowledging psychological trauma on the battlefront. When the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan had their war in 1904, this was kind of considered by some the first great war of the 20th century. This was the war over Manchuria and Korea. At the time, Russia was seeking a warm water port in the Pacific Ocean for their warships as well as their maritime trade ships. And although most of the armies today, or at that time, believed that the Russians were right in treating these psychiatric casualties close to the front of the battle, and the goal was to return them back into the battle, they were not so successful. But the significance of this time was the fact that the Russian army was the first army in history to determine that a mental collapse was a direct consequence of the stress of war and should be regarded as a legitimate medical concern. This kind of changed military psychiatry. This changed how military psychiatry had to look at the causes of some of these symptoms that were being displayed by their soldiers. And with the notion of proximity or forward treatment, the Russians would basically meet soldiers that needed treatment near the front lines, would treat them in the best way that they possibly could, but the goal was to get them back into the battle, get them back into the front. And obviously, this was not too successful. Less than 20% of the soldiers that were treated on the front during this war returned to battle. They were just incapable of doing so. So, April 6, 1917, the US joins the Allies in Britain, France, and Russia. During World War I, almost 2 million American men were sent overseas to fight in Europe. Deaths, over 116,000. The wounded, over 204,000. Affected psychologically and removed from combat, almost 160,000 men. And nearly half of those men, 70,000, were permanently discharged for their inability to return. So the term shell shock came about during this war. Shell shock was coined by a British physician, Charles Myers, to describe symptoms of mental trauma that soldiers began to display. Now, during World War I, it was a different kind of warfare, primarily trench warfare. Soldiers were involved in sometimes month-long battles. There were large numbers of casualties, sometimes fighting in these trenches next to bodies that had been lying there for days. There was limited space. And the effects on mental health of soldiers started to really take its toll. There was a constant barrage of artillery, not to mention a constant flow of toxic gas or mustard gas. It's an incredible photograph, isn't it? So the notion of shell shock was believed to be caused by a concussion that disrupted the physiology of the brain, thus come the name of shell shock. Some of the symptoms we saw that were noted in this notion of shell shock, these staring eyes, these violent tremors, extremities that were cold, sometimes even turning blue, and sometimes unexplained deafness, blindness, or even paralysis. Many of the Australian and British psychiatrists at the time attributed this kind of suffering not to the conditions primarily of warfare, but felt that it had to do with an individual of maybe weak character and constitution, or lack of character. This notion of the effects, psychological effects, was not fully accepted. Many of these soldiers that suffered this trauma were called cowards, weak, and not able to uphold the stress of war. There was many soldiers who started to implement self-injury. 3,000 cases in the British Army during this time, 3,000 soldiers in the British Army during this war deserted. And over 300 were tried and court-martialed and actually given a death sentence for their desertion. I have a video here. I'd like the short video here, if it comes on. Nope. Is it not working? Okay. Don't you love technology? Oh yeah, now try it. I think it has to be on full screen to play. Just put it in full screen. And then it should automatically come on. One more after that. Okay, let's see what happens here. There we go.
Others proved unable to overcome the psychological impact of war after living in these trenches full of mud, dirt, and dead bodies. The form of trauma known as shell shock was very common among war veterans, and it caused its sufferers to undergo fits of intense fear and shaking. The fear of being bombed, which they had lived with every day for 4 years on end, was engraved in their brains. Some patients felt compelled to go hide themselves at the mere mention of the word bomb. Some veterans even felt terror grip them whenever they saw a uniform. Tens of thousands of soldiers also lost one or more limbs in this war.
Okay. In 1917, the United States Army Surgeon General's office created a comprehensive treatment and program for these individuals that were suffering from shell shock. For the first time, we started placing psychiatrists in combat units close to the front. The treatment centered around what's called proximity. Proximity includes the immediacy, or treating the soldier as close to the battle as possible. Simplicity, providing simple treatment such as rest, a warm shower, hot food, and expectancy. The expectation that the soldier will return to the fight after he has been treated. So this notion of proximity and forwardness was about treating them on the line, giving them what they needed for that time, but the plan was always the plan to return them back to battle. Many soldiers that were removed from the battlefronts were referred to as having an acute stress disorder. Acute meaning temporary, short-lived, which usually implies this temporary psychological reaction which reduces one's ability to function. But we now understand that psychological trauma, or any psychologically traumatic event that is outside the range of normal human experience, can have long, and usually has long-term effects, both physical and mental. So the experience of shell shock was kind of a major development, again, in psychiatry and psychology, especially in military psychiatry. It was something that they could no longer ignore. They were forced with the realization that otherwise normal people would break down under sufficient stress. World War I served as a catalyst, consolidating the acceptance of pure psychological causes for mental symptoms. The biggest problem was a belief that all these cases were transitory or acute. This is what we wanted to believe, that they'll get better and it won't be long before they get better. But many, many did not. After the war, it was an interesting thing happened in Vienna, that the Austrian War Ministry was starting to get many, many complaints, saying that many of the individuals who returned from war were showing signs of what was being called war neurosis, and possibly have even been mistreated by army doctors or not treated sufficiently. At the time, Sigmund Freud was in Vienna and was making a name for himself. So the ministry even asked Sigmund Freud, would you kind of give us an evaluation of what you think is going on? Well, Freud, as some of you may know, never lost an opportunity for an audience and to have his theories kind of put out there. So Freud kind of talked about his notion that they were suffering this war neurosis was basically an unconscious or subconscious conflict of ego. Now, Freud really was big on conflict, so a lot of what we read about Freud is always kind of in relation to conflict. But what he said was that he felt that these individuals that went off to war started off with what he called a peacetime ego. And then, after being subjected in combat, they developed a new kind of ego, a war-type ego. And when they returned, their peace ego was fearful of being faced with the danger of being killed by their newly formed war ego. Now Freud kind of talked about how the old ego will always tend to protect itself, even by taking flight. So Sigmund Freud might have been onto something here. Matter of fact, his notion and his theory didn't really take off too well. Wasn't a lot of acceptance. But he did say something which kind of makes sense. Because in many, many people that we see severely traumatized and with PTSD, there's that level that they will kind of even dissociate. They kind of separate themselves. They remove themselves from the reality. And this is what Freud may have been implying to. So again, he may have been onto something. Give him the benefit of the doubt. In World War II, in the 4 years that we were involved in World War II, 800,000 soldiers saw direct combat. And of these, 37.5% became serious psychiatric cases and were permanently discharged. The U.S. Army alone, not counting the Army air crews, over 500,000 men were removed from combat for psychiatric reasons. And another almost 4 million suffered debilitating symptoms as well. So it became clear that it was not just the weak in character who were breaking down in combat, but the Army still, at this point, wanted to maintain a model of what they called predisposition. Predisposition applying to one's character. So they felt that this notion of predisposition plus the stress of battle was mainly caused by their sense of character. It wasn't the battle itself. And if they were weak in character, then it would have affected them. But again, it was the focus was on the individual, not the stressor. So during World War II, we kind of had the same symptoms, but a lot of different names. Traumatic war neurosis, combat fatigue, or battle fatigue sometimes, battle stress, and this gross stress reaction. Also in World War II, men were treated at the front or near the front of the battle, and the forward treatment was also employed. Treat them at the scene, give them some kind of treatment which will relieve some of the anxiety, and then send them back out to the front. The one thing we did learn in World War II that was significant is that soldiers developed a resilience to battle if they were fully connected to the people they were fighting with, or fighting next to, I should say, their comrades. A unit cohesion seemed to develop a stronger resilience to some of the symptoms we saw or see here. So this notion of trauma started to become a little more well-known, not only within the military and in the battlefront and with the Army psychiatrists, but the public was starting to have more awareness of what trauma really kind of represented. A good example of this occurred in 1942, November 28th, in Boston, Massachusetts, when a famous nightclub, the Coconut Grove, caught on fire, and over 400 people died, and 300 people were injured. The people that went into this building to remove the bodies afterwards showed signs that were very, very similar to the same kinds of symptoms we saw with those soldiers returning back from war. The notion of stress and what we call today now post-traumatic stress was starting to become more evident now, not only with the military arena, but now in the public sector. We know this too by our experiences with 9/11 and how it affected those individuals that went into those buildings. And now, with the United States at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we see that this notion of stress-related, post-traumatic stress, I should say, is very, very much now in the public eye. So with that came a more awareness and more how we started to define this notion of stress and what it really meant and how it affected us. A doctor by the name of Han Sella, who is known to be the person who actually coined the word stress, did much, much research. He was a biochemist, And he wanted to kind of find out how a body responds to certain demands that it was placed on it. What physiological changes would happen if certain demands were placed on it. And he's the one that kind of came up with this notion of this general adaptation syndrome, talking about alarm, mobilization, that fight or flight kind of situation. This Dr. Sella is responsible for that. But one thing he found to be true was that prolonged or repeated exposure to a stressor will have serious implications, not only to the emotional health, but now made it known to physical health as well. Interesting little side note about Dr. Sella. Dr. Sella was from Hungary, spoke about 6 or 7 different languages, spoke English, but didn't speak English too well. And the word stress itself, he meant to say strain. And every time he said strain, someone interpreted it as stress. And then it just became widely known, and so he finally gave up and said, okay, it's stress. So, becoming a little more updated now with what we knew about trauma and how we classify trauma and how we treat trauma. Back in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association put together what is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's quite a mouthful. We refer to it normally as the DSM. And this was developed again by the American Psychiatric Association. And during that time, because of this awareness of this notion of stress, and we related stress as an anxiety disorder, a category was placed in this manual called, the category was given the name of gross stress disorder, and was given to define a stress syndrome that is a response to an exceptional physical or mental stressor, such as a natural catastrophe or even battle itself. But there was still a lot of discrepancy. People were still saying, is it really a valid diagnosis? Can we really kind of look at stress and kind of classify this as a diagnosis? Because in these statistical manuals, this is kind of the Bible of any kind of mental disorder, which gives us a classification. There's a classification, and to meet that classification, certain symptoms have to be met to give that classification. And then once a classification is given, this is kind of the basis of how we treat, what we look for treatment. But there was a lot of discrepancy. A lot of people were saying, this really isn't valid. It doesn't belong in this book. Stress isn't something that's just a mental disorder or could cause one. So in 1968, the DSM-2, which was a revision of the first one, was published, and the diagnosis of gross stress disorder was omitted. It was not given a part of these mental disorders. Now, if you remember back in 1968, we were in another war, Vietnam War. And there was a lot of unpopularity about the war itself, but also we were seeing a lot of people coming back from the war, kind of again, almost reminding us of what it was like back in the Civil War. Wandering, seemed to be homeless, not having a sense of where they wanted to be, just kind of wandering aimlessly. And there was an outcry that something needed to be done with these individuals coming back from the Vietnam War. So by the mid-70s, more research was done, and we were becoming more aware of how stress affects us and creates this notion of psychological trauma. And by 1980, the DSM-3 was then developed, and finally a category of post-traumatic stress was given and included in the book. There have been other revisions. The most current revision now is the DSM-5. And in the DSM-3R, which means R mean revised, appeared in 1987 with many modifications addressing stress syndromes. So we finally found a home and some validation for some of the things that we have been seeing for years. More interest in clinicians of how to treat stress disorders, and more emphasis was given to the psychological nature of stress as well as the physical components of stress. And that still stands today. So we've reached a point now where we're looking at this notion of post-traumatic stress. Some of the signs and symptoms that we see with those suffering from this illness, efforts to avoid thoughts, avoiding activities, kind of removing themselves from activities. It affects memory. Memory is highly affected. Anhedonia, which is basically a lack of finding pleasure in life. Feeling flat. Many of their affect, individuals that suffer from this, have what we would refer to as a flat affect, showing little signs of emotion. A sense of a foreshortened future, not seeing that their lives will extend to great lengths, seeing their lives being short-lived. Many of them report flashbacks, difficulty with sleep, irritability, or even outbursts of anger, hypervigilance, always on guard, difficulty concentrating, exaggerated startle response, and intrusive thoughts. In some cases, the PTSD symptoms may not appear until years later after the event. And usually now what we do with PTSD, we usually group them into three parts, or three types, I should say. Those with excessive intrusive memories, those that practice avoidance and numbing, and those that have high levels of anxiety. Those that have PTSD tend to have a greater risk of other disorders as well. It could include depression, substance use disorders, anxiety disorders. 80% of the people with PTSD do develop some other disorder as well. What we see a lot in commonplace with those suffering from PTSD, higher unemployment or unable to keep a job, relationships become strained, health problems, anger, signs of violence, and generally just a worse quality of life. Just to kind of elaborate on some of these, in families that have a victim of PTSD also suffer from PTSD. There's also this way of how families can kind of almost have the same kinds of symptoms because they're exposed to someone who is having PTSD as well. We know that in families, relationships become very, very difficult with someone who has PTSD. There's avoidance of social situations. They have nightmares, sometimes night terrors. Depression is common, and a lot of anger and a lot of guilt. Health problems sometimes become predominant as well. Habits that the individual had that didn't have prior to developing this PTSD start to rise. People start to smoke, start to take drugs, start to drink. Lack of exercise, becoming more lethargic, and just becoming more, life becomes just more problematic for them. Also, we see these individuals that suffer from PTSD who have feelings of not being able to provide for their families. Guilt is sometimes something which becomes very, very predominant. Not being able to provide for the family economically, emotionally, or if you're unable to control your feelings, you just don't feel as if you have any control in your life anymore. So how do we treat these individuals? We're learning, we're getting better at it. We're still not that great at it, but we are getting better at it. But some of these that I've listed here seem to be some of the most effective forms of treatment for these individuals suffering from PTSD. Cognitive behavioral therapy seems to be the most effective kind of psychotherapy for these individuals. Cognitive behavioral therapy, the goal in cognitive behavioral therapy is to kind of have your client understand certain thoughts about the trauma that they experienced and kind of understand how those thoughts are affecting them physically. They learn how to replace damaging thoughts with more accurate and less distracting thoughts. It takes time and it takes a lot of work, but getting an individual to start identifying their thinking, how they're thinking, and how that thinking is affecting them, if we can somehow find ways of how they can alter their thinking, then the goal is that the behavior will change as well. Medication can be effective. Psychotropic medication can be effective. The problem with psychotropic medication is that medications affect people in different ways. So we have to sometimes go through a lot of trial and error. The dose is right and making sure the medication is meeting the needs of the individual. The other problem is too that psychotropic medication, we start to develop a tolerance to it. And so adjustments in the dose has to constantly be monitored and made. And like any other medication, there are side effects, and sometimes there are some severe side effects. Loss of appetite, gaining weight, dizziness, feeling kind of lethargic, memory, concentration problems, all those things sometimes are interacted with these medications that we prescribe. Family therapy we found to be very important for these individuals that are suffering from PTSD as well, because there are so many issues that are coming up within that family unit, and families need to learn to understand why their loved ones are acting the way they are, why they're doing the things they're doing, why their life has changed, and there has to be a way of communicating not only the needs of the client, but the needs of the family as well. And last but not least, antidepressants is like with the medication, but we're finding that one of the treatments that seems to be effective today is this virtual reality therapy. And the virtual reality therapy sometimes is referred to as exposure therapy. And this is where, through the technology of virtual reality, individuals are they wear these headgears, and they start to confront the trauma and the memories and the re-experiencing of what they had experienced, but this time in a virtual world. This virtual world that is kind of being provided to them under a safe and controlled condition. The virtual worlds that they use the points of reference and the landscapes, they kind of line it up to where the soldier was, what the conditions were, and they actually create the scene for them. So again, it allows them to kind of have this exposure to it and to relive it and to learn to kind of work through it. It almost becomes like a sense of desensitizing. The more I do it and the more I see it and the more I understand it, the more I can deal with it. And this tends to work, not too surprisingly, tends to work better with the young military personnel. Why? Because these are the individuals who have grown up in a digital technology. And they tend to be more attracted to it and tend to be more comfortable in undergoing this kind of therapy. So I'd like now to share with you a video of a Staff Sergeant Billy Cavanes, He is a 16-year veteran and served 4 tours in Afghanistan. And this is his description of what PTSD is like.
combat zone and home, but now to me, everything's combat zone. And that's because of the PTSD. And if you got it, you'll understand exactly what I'm saying. I joined the Army in May of '96. I've been in 16 years come May, and I've been on 4 deployments. Well, the camp that I was at is called Combat Outpost Psychological Miracle. We were down in the Garnhall Valley, surrounded by mountains, and over to the left-hand side of us where I was, my motor pool was at, was Pakistan, and every day was a fight for survival, and you just didn't know when it was coming, but you knew it was coming. 1st of May, I got a briefing around 11:30 on what was going to happen that following morning. I came back and briefed my soldiers, prepared for battle. Our main objective was to man the front gate. Anybody come through that front gate, they were dead. All of a sudden, we hear one whistle. First round lands on the left-hand side of us. It knocks me and all my guys on our backs. We jump up. The second round came in, hit one of the fuel tanks on the 22-ton crane. The last mortar round, an RPG recoilless round, landed 6 to 8 feet in front of me and my guys. It blew me down first, and then 5 to 6 of my guys got hurt, and 2 of them seriously wounded, and one of them being me, and PFC Rips, he almost died. My injuries, I got wounded in the penis and my right thigh. I took, can't give you an exact number of shrapnel. You know, that's my man who, when I first came to in the infirmary out in Napoleonic Era, Cache Valley, I just couldn't believe it. I was hysterical, just in shock. And me and my wife always think about having a 3rd kid, so that's a no, it's over. There's a lot of things that come along with severe PTSD. Sleepwalking, can't sleep for days at a time. When you do sleep, you only sleep for an hour or 2, and you're right back up for 3 or 4 days. Hallucinations, constantly thinking about the situation what was at hand that put you in the situation you are in now. Thinking about and seeing the faces of the soldiers that either passed on or got hurt severely. That's an everyday struggle for me. That's our cabin, San Antonio, Texas. Me and my guys got hit for 4 mortars and a 4th RPG round. Left me some scratch on that was a really big help to be around other vets and soldiers that have been into similar circumstances like getting wounded or getting blown up and getting hurt real bad. We all could relate, and from the day that I walked in there until the day that I walked out and graduated, let me tell you something, that makes a really big difference for somebody just to understand. You know what I mean? 305, 350? Yeah, like 200 people call it treatment. Being around those guys that have been through similar situations, it's one of the best things ever. I used to blame myself all the time for them soldiers getting hurt and almost coming to death. But I also got to realize I was the first one to get hit. And I also got to understand and tell myself that it wasn't my fault. I did everything I could to keep my soldiers safe, and I was the first one to get blown down. So that's another part that keeps me going. I think that helps me move along sometimes.
Every good story should have a happy ending. So in conclusion, regardless what we call it, trauma has always and likely always will be an aspect of what we call the human condition. Trauma cannot be transcended. It's an inherent part of our body. The only way we would be able to release ourselves individually, and perhaps even globally, is to learn to transform the effects it leaves on us. A better understanding of the interplay between the physical and the psychological components of trauma need more study. There are still many more questions that need to be resolved. Questions about how our mind and body connect, the complex interaction between the severity and the duration of a stressor on an individual, the ability to effectively use coping skills which are aligned with the person's experience of the trauma itself. Throughout history, men and women have acted to surpass the horrors that they have seen. It's time we recognize that for what it is, as not only an outward manifestation of trauma or PTSD, or whatever you want to call it, but the clearest evidence that we have that wars are destructive in other ways other than just body counts. Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist and survived during World War II 4 Nazi concentration camps. Camps where he saw his wife perish, his parents perish, and wrote a book afterwards called Man's Search for Meaning. Said this: an abnormal response to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. Or, as a student once told me, in talking about his own version of PTSD, if some things don't make you crazy, then you aren't sane to begin with. Thank you. I can take questions. I can try to answer if you have any questions. Yes?
About PTSD and the effect on the families. I've been here 20 years in New York, and one of the first most precedented cases of 1993 PTSD, all heck broke loose after that. And the trauma that I experienced from the wars that were going on right here have never been addressed. And then when everyone went crazy, that's it. I just forgot about it. Forget me. Forget the work I did. Forget how it's affected me.
Right.
And I resent that. As you know, because I served too.
Right.
So I hope there is more treatment for the family.
I agree. And I think a lot of focus now is focusing on the family. Not only working with the individual, but bringing family members and extended family members as well, because they're affected as well. That's unfortunate. That's unfortunate. Thank you for sharing. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
During those years,
Oh, I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
during those years when stress was locked as a medical condition, I forget how many years you showed up there. Was there any recognition or treatment for any of these people?
They were treating more, excuse me, I'd probably get in the microphone here. They were treating more, not looking at it as a stress disorder, but looking at it more as an anxiety disorder. So it was treated more as anxiety than stress. Anxiety can be something in which we kind of contain internally, something we worry about. Stress could be something from the outside. So the treatment was actually a little different, but I think more of the treatment was more focused on anxiety other than stress. Yes, sir.
My impression that those serving now are older and more mature than those who served during the Vietnam period. How is that affecting their response to combat?
That's a good question, and I wish I had a good answer for you, but I really don't know. I would imagine because of the maturity, they would be more resilient, if anything, But again, age factor, I wish I had an answer for you. I'm sorry I don't. But it's an excellent question, though. Excellent question. Yes, ma'am.
There seemed to have something on TV about PTSD with veterans and dogs, maybe other animals.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you addressed that at all. I was over there.
I didn't address that, but we know that dogs can be extremely therapeutic. We see that in bringing dogs into hospices. We see dogs bringing into convalescent homes. And we found that dogs actually create a very calming effect. And they are being utilized more and more in therapy. So it would make sense that those that are suffering from PTSD, that could be part of their therapy as well. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Are they still using the dynamic saying the predisposition issue as a major component of PTSD?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. I think that's something that's been basically eliminated. We don't acknowledge that anymore as far as predisposition, as far as PTSD. Maybe I shouldn't say that so strongly. It might be, but it isn't something part of the treatment, it isn't something on how we diagnose that. We don't look at predisposition. But there may be some out there that still believe that that may be how we deal with it, the resiliency, how we not deal with it may be a factor.
One other component, have you heard any studies or any outcomes of the fact that they are sending these individuals back into combat after the break? Okay, 4 tours, that's 4 tours. Now, some tours in different organizations are based on different levels.
Uh-huh.
Right now, DOD does 5-month tours.
Uh-huh.
That's a tour, doesn't matter. You're still coming back, you're coming back to the United States. But repetitive combat in stressful situations where you're on the front line, that is, to me, a tour for disaster.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know when the Army or the military is going to take recognition of that, but I hope someday they do.
I agree with you. I agree that there should be a limit to how many times they can be redeployed or choose to be redeployed. I think there should be a limit to that. But at this time, I'm not aware that there is one. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I'm trying to form a question that I don't quite have put together.
That's okay. Just say what's on your mind.
I'm 79, which, according to some of you, is young, and some of you old. But I see it as a very short period of time in history. And I see something happening here when you first talked about war in the 400s BC until now, that we somehow are becoming a little bit of age about post-traumatic stress. I don't think that it still makes sense to religious leaders of all religions or leaders in general, that somehow we still pontificate war. And I guess, having a couple of kids that have been career armed forces, I know we need them, but there seems to be an unfair balance, and I happen to come from the Christian persuasion, but I see Christendom as well as other religions continuing to honor, to give great celebration if we serve. And I'm not trying to be it seems to me it's as untruthful as it was we didn't used to believe there was stress.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now we know it, but still, leaders in all phases, whether it's academic or, I don't see us saying, geez, oh Pete, let's take a look at this as compared to a Gandhi or rather than just argue. There's so many facts here about this. It affects much more of us than the deaths, and we want to have fun and more reporting death counts. The other side, yay, 4 times as many as ours.
Mm-hmm.
When I see that the biggest problem is, not the biggest, I don't want to, because I've lost friends and relatives too, but somehow the trauma beyond that should behoove us sometimes to say, for God's sake, let's not eulogize the worst of what has to happen. I'm putting it in the form of a question. There's just a few people here. How many people in the city of, in in our 100,000 people here, even still, think it's great to go to war. And it is. I mean, you get a lot more heroes welcome by going to war than you do to die for peace.
I agree. I agree. I don't know how to make a comment on that other than I think what you said. I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Thank you. Yes, there was one more. Do we have any more time for one more question, or maybe one more question if there is one? Ma'am?
I'd like to ask what you think, I know there's more that needs to be done. What would you suggest? I mean, we still have homeless veterans on the streets, some in prisons, people not getting, doesn't seem to me to be getting adequate care. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I can probably come up with a lot of them if I had more time to think about it. But one of the things I think that could be really utilized is more availability to any kind of mental health treatment, free mental health treatment, treatment that is made easily available to these people that need some help, that wouldn't cost them anything, that could be seen on a regular basis. The problem, I think, sometimes with how treatment sometimes is given is their treatment is kind of given within how many allowed sessions can a person have? What is a person entitled to? I say break those walls down and basically give whatever is needed to treat these individuals so they can have a better quality of life, whatever that may mean, and however that may cost. I say that this is something that should be readily available 24/7 to these individuals. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
This is a perfectly good example of why we do interdisciplinary lectures, because it brings in so many different aspects in regards to the war. And we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then in 10 minutes we'll have a presentation on how the Great War modernized medicine. And just a quick reminder, tonight at 7 o'clock, we are having another film, How Johnny Got His Gun, and this is 1971. So really it tells you a lot about the Vietnam War as opposed to World War I, right? We'll see you in about 10 minutes.